This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance and Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to take a look at the Bear creature type. Bear is one of Magic's oldest creature types, with Grizzly Bears appearing in Magic's very first set. That particular card ended up being iconic enough that we refer to any 2-mana 2/2 as a bear. By the way, if you're interested in a top 10 on that kind of bear, I've got you covered too. While bears haven't ever been a heavily supported creature type or anything, one or two of them do show up in most sets. Seems like most planes in the multiverse happen to have bears that look just like the ones we have in our world. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the bear creature type or be capable of making a bear creature token. In all, there were 66 cards eligible, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Caller of the Claw. For 2 generic and a green, it's a 2/2 with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you get a 2/2 bear token for each non-token creature put into your graveyard from the battlefield that turn. If you only get one bear out of the Caller, you're getting a fairly efficient deal, and the ceiling is a lot higher than that. While the Caller never saw heavy play in any format, it does have multi-format success. It has shown up as a sideboard card or singleton card to tutor up in aggro decks, in Standard, Vintage, and Legacy. This is because it's particularly useful against sweepers, as it lets you completely rebuild your board. It doesn't have any points since 2008 though. At number 9, it's Flax and Intruder, a card that references Goldilocks and the Three Bears, although a much more grim version of it. Anyway, for 1 green mana, the Intruder is a 1/2, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you can sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. She also comes with an adventure called Welcome Home, a sorcery that costs 5 generic and 2 green, and makes 3 2/2 bear tokens. If a creature has an adventure, you also have the option of casting that adventure side, and when you do, the card gets exiled and you can cast it as a creature later. The design here is nice because if you have it in your opening hand, you're just playing your 1 mana 1/2 with upside, but you have a way more impactful option if you get it late. All of the Intruder's points came in Standard, where it was played in adventure decks. These decks used Edgewall Innkeeper and Lucky Clover to get extra value out of adventures. This was so effective that the Clover eventually got banned. Flax and Intruder hasn't gained points in any other formats. At number 8, it's Fade from History. For 2 generic and 2 green, this sorcery gives each player who controls an artifact or enchantment a 2/2 bear token, and then it destroys all artifacts and enchantments. In other words, it's pretty efficient at naturalizing the whole board, but that's balanced by the fact that it at least gives players a little something back. It isn't always downside either, because if you happen to have a treasure token in play or something, you can also get a 2/2, and it's likely if you're playing this, your opponent took a much harder hit from the effect. Fade from History is seeing sideboard play in both Standard and Modern, and while it will probably never be a staple in either format, it's got a good chance at gaining more points. At number 7, it's Bearscape. It has the same total score as Fade from History, but more first-tier top 8s, so it gets the higher slot. This enchantment costs 1 generic and 2 green, and when it's in play, you can pay 1 generic and a green and exile 2 cards in your graveyard to make a 2/2 bear token. If you've got a well-stocked graveyard, this can build a pretty serious bear army. Bearscape gained all of its points in 2002 in Block, Constructed, and Standard. The Block and Standard at the time featured a whole lot of decks that put things in the graveyard quickly. Threshold decks wanted to get cards in the graveyard as quickly as possible, and powerful creatures like Wild Mongrel gave you an extra incentive to discard cards, so these decks could turn their graveyards into bears pretty efficiently. At number 6, it's Path to the World Tree. For 1 generic and a green, this enchantment searches you up a basic land when it enters the battlefield. It also has an activated ability that costs 2 generic and 1 of each color, and you sacrifice it, then you gain 2 life, draw 2 cards, your opponent loses 2 life, and you do 2 damage to a creature, and most importantly for this list, you make a 2/2 bear. That effect gives you a ton of value, but obviously setting up Path isn't the easiest thing in the world. But it does help you by fixing your mana. I do think it's worth noting it was actually really doable in Kaldheim Limited, so it probably shouldn't be too surprising that people have pulled it off in 60 card formats too. It's gained all of its points in Pioneer Fires of Invention decks. That's a deck that looks to get the powerful enchantment in play, but once you do, you can't use your mana to cast spells. The deck looks to still make use of its mana with powerful activated abilities, and Path to the World Tree certainly qualifies. In that deck, playing the Path and then using the ability in the same turn is eminently doable. It's likely to continue to see play in Pioneer, though it isn't seeing play in every Fires of Invention deck, so it probably isn't going to gain that many points. At number 5, it's Fantasiamal Bear, the first creature with the bear type on the list. Everything else so far has made a bear token, but there's a lot less of that the rest of the way, because 4 out of the top 5 on this list are creatures with the bear type. Anyway, Fantasiamal Bear is a 2/2 that costs a single blue mana, so it of course comes with a downside for being that efficient. If it becomes a target of anything, you have to sacrifice it. This means you can't really buff it, and any targeting card your opponent has turns into removal, but that's well worth it for such an efficient creature. I mean, the downside is pretty minimal most of the time because it's going to die to most removal anyway, so it doesn't upgrade your opponent's cards that much in most cases. Fantasiamal Bear found all of its success in standard Illusions decks between 2011 and 2012. These decks played Lord of the Unreal, an illusion lord that not only buffed them all, but also gave them hexproof. So, with the lord in play, you didn't need to worry about the bear's downside at all. At number 4, it's Spectral Bears, which has the same total score as Fantasiamal Bear, but more first-tier top 8s, so it gets the higher slot. Like Fantasiamal Bear, Spectral Bears is a super efficient bear with downside. In this case, you spend 1 generic and a green for a 3/3, but if it attacks and your opponent doesn't control a black non-token permanent, it doesn't untap during your next untap step. That might sound like a sideboard card, but Spectral Bears was played in the main deck for all 4 of its Pro Tour top 8s. This is because the Bears have a pretty reasonable fail case. They're a fairly efficient blocker on the ground, and you can still attack with it every other turn, so it gives you pretty good value for the mana you spend. And then, when you run into someone playing black, it just becomes a great attacker. And black was an incredibly common color for the opponent to play while it was in Standard 2, as Necropotence decks were dominating the field. So in that metagame, the downside hardly ever came up anyway. At number 3, it's Vivians Grizzly. For 2 generic and a green, the Grizzly is a 2/3, and it comes with an activated ability that costs 3 generic and a green. It lets you look at the top card of your library, and if it's a creature or planeswalker, you can reveal it and put it into your hand. If you don't put it into your hand, you put it on the bottom of your library. All of the Grizzlies' points have come in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, and it sees play there because if you can produce infinite mana, it lets you rip through your deck until you find whatever creature you want. There just so happens to be a Pauper deck that can produce infinite mana, Wall Combo. This deck uses Axebane Guardian and a bunch of other defenders alongside Freed from the Real to make infinite mana, and if you don't have your win condition right away, the Grizzly will find it for you. It's going to keep gaining points in Pauper in the future. At number 2, it's ARG Goth Sanctum of Nature. This land enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a legendary green creature. It can tap for green, and it has an activated ability that gets it on this list. You can pay 2 generic and 2 green to make a 2/2 bear token and mill 3 cards, but only at sorcery speed. It can also meld with Titania Voice of Gaia to create the completely absurd Titania Gaia Incarnate, a massive creature with Vigilance, Reach, Trample, and Haste that reanimates all of your lands and animates lands too. No one really tries to do that in Standard though, where it's just played in Golgari Graveyard decks as a value engine. It does happen sometimes in Legacy though, where they are played in Maverick decks, which are fairly adept at tutoring up the singleton Titania Voice of Gaia in the deck. ARG Goth is going to keep seeing play in both formats, and it has a pretty good shot at eventually being the number 1 card on this list. For now though, that number 1 card is Werebear. For 1 generic and a green, this human bear druid is a 1/1, and it can tap for green mana. It also has Threshold, which means if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, it gets even better. In this case, it becomes a 4/4. As I mentioned earlier when discussing Bearscape, Threshold decks were a huge deal in multiple formats in the early 2000s, and in that kind of deck, Werebear played a lot like Tarmogoyf, several years before that card was ever printed. It was pretty nice, it could ramp your mana too. If the Werebear hadn't quite reached the point where it could start attacking, it did let you play more powerful spells more quickly. Unfortunately, Werebear's heyday came to an end way back in 2005, but it still did enough over those few years to have a pretty solid hold on the number 1 spot on this list. Though, as I mentioned, I think ARG Goth will probably pass it in the end. So those are the top 10 bears in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the best cards with a specific creature type, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.